All right, everyone, get ready because today we are diving deep into the world of psychopathy. You wanted to know what it is, how to spot it, and why it even matters, so we are going way beyond those typical Hollywood cliches. We are going to unpack this complex personality disorder, and we've got some fascinating research to help us do it. Actually, the source material is in German, but don't worry, we'll break it all down. We're talking about things like the three levels of psychopathy, the hair checklist, and some surprising, really surprising characteristics. This one is going to get interesting. So, okay, let's get started. So, to start us off, when we say psychopathy, what is the real picture? What are we actually dealing with here?
Yeah, it's a lot more nuanced than many people realize. It's not just about criminal masterminds or violent tendencies. Psychopathy is a personality disorder,
Yeah.
and uh, like most things in psychology, it exists on a spectrum. The core issue, this is where it gets really fascinating, is a profound lack of empathy, and that's paired with an inability to distinguish right from wrong in a moral sense.
So it's like the wiring that connects, most humans to each other on an emotional level is just missing.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. What's even more intriguing is that some research suggests there might be a neurological basis for this. So certain areas of the brain associated with empathy and emotional processing, they may be underdeveloped or just function differently in individuals with psychopathic traits.
So it's not necessarily a choice, but something more deeply rooted in their brain structure. That's unsettling. This reminds me of a character in the movie Gone Girl, Amy Dunn. She was a master manipulator, completely cold and calculating. Obviously, not a diagnosis or anything, but could that character be an example of this spectrum that you're talking about?
Absolutely, and it really highlights how these traits can exist outside of a clinical setting. And how even fictional characters can help us understand, real world psychology. The important thing is that psychopathy isn't a one-size-fits-all label. The source material we're looking at today, it actually breaks down psychopathy into three distinct levels. So we have cold-heartedness, manipulation, and impulsivity. Cold-heartedness, as you might guess, refers to that lack of empathy and emotional coldness we've been discussing. Manipulation, well, I think that one is pretty self-explanatory, using charm and cunning to exploit others. And then finally, impulsivity, a disregard for consequences, a tendency to act without thinking.
Okay, so three levels, and they all sort of feed into this complex disorder. And to measure these levels, psychologists use this thing called the hair checklist, right?
Exactly. The Hare Psychopathy Checklist. It's a tool that's used to assess the presence and severity of psychopathic traits. It gives us 20 traits, each scored on a scale of 0 to 2. So some of these traits, aside from the superficial charm we often hear about, include things like glibness and superficial charm, a grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, conning, and manipulativeness. It really paints a detailed picture.
Wow, so a checklist to potentially spot a psychopath. That's both intriguing and a little unnerving, isn't it? Out of all those traits, what stands out to you as the most surprising or telling?
That's a good question. One of the most fascinating and perhaps counterintuitive traits is superficial charm. So psychopaths can be incredibly charismatic and likable, but but it's a facade. It's a calculated tactic for manipulation. They're masters at reading people, figuring out their weaknesses, and then using that knowledge to their advantage.
So it's not genuine warmth, but like a strategic move. That's kind of chilling. And then there's the lack of empathy, which, we've already touched on. But help me understand this. If they can read people so well, do they understand those feelings but simply choose not to care?
That's where it's complex. It's not about choosing not to care. It's about a genuine inability to understand or share those emotions on a fundamental level. Imagine um, uh, imagine seeing a play. You understand the words and the actions, but the emotional impact just doesn't register. And this emotional disconnect allows them to engage in some really manipulative behaviors. The source material actually mentions a technique called gaslighting. So imagine someone systematically denying your reality, twisting your words, making you doubt your own memories and perceptions. It's insidious and it's incredibly damaging.
That's messed up. I mean, you hear about gaslighting, but I never really connected it to psychopathy specifically. It's like they're playing mind games, but with much higher stakes.
Exactly. Their actions are often deliberate and calculated, driven by a need for control. Yeah. And a complete disregard for the well-being of others.
So if they lack empathy, are master manipulators, what is happening inside their heads? Like, what is driving this behavior? What is their worldview like?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's what we're going to unpack next. They have a very distorted view of the world, one where they are the center, and everyone else is just a tool to be used. We'll talk more about the specifics a little bit later.
All right.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've established that psychopaths lack empathy, and they can be incredibly manipulative. But what's the motivation behind all of this? Like, what's going on inside their minds?
Well, to put it simply, their worldview is fundamentally different from ours. The source material describes it as a deeply egocentric perspective. They see themselves as superior, like the main character in their own narrative, and everyone else is just a supporting player in their story. So it's like they're living in their own reality where the usual rules they just don't apply.
Precisely. Their actions are driven by a need for power, control, and self-gratification, often at the expense of others. They operate on a utilitarian principle, meaning they only care about outcomes that benefit them, regardless of the ethical implications or the impact on other
No,
people.
that's pretty disturbing. So we're not just talking about someone who's, a bit selfish or inconsiderate. We're talking about a completely different way of processing the world and interacting with others. It's like they have their own set of rules, right? Rules that benefit them, regardless of who gets hurt.
You hit the nail on the head. The source material also talks about antisocial thinking. And it's not just about being a loner or being shy. It's about a complete disregard for societal norms and the rights of others. They believe they're above the law, that rules simply don't apply to them.
Okay, this is all starting to make sense, but it's also pretty terrifying. I'm starting to see how all these traits, the lack of empathy, the manipulativeness, the distorted worldview, they all come together to create a potentially very dangerous personality type. But you mentioned earlier that, not every person with psychopathic traits is going to be, a criminal or a violent offender. So how do we differentiate?
That's a crucial point. We're talking about a spectrum here. Some individuals might exhibit certain psychopathic traits without ever engaging in, criminal behavior. They might be highly successful in certain fields, especially those that reward ruthlessness or a lack of emotional attachment.
That's a scary thought. Someone with these traits in a position of power. But how would we even recognize someone like that in everyday life? Are there any warning signs that we should be aware of?
Well, it's not always easy, especially since they're often so adept at blending in. But based on the source material, there are some potential indicators, though it's important to emphasize that these are not diagnostic criteria, just things to be mindful of.
Of course, yeah, we're not trying to play armchair psychologist here, but I think everyone listening is probably thinking the same thing. Give us the signs.
Well, one of the most obvious, as we discussed, is that that excessive, almost too perfect charm. If someone seems too slick, too good to be true, it might be worth paying attention to that gut feeling. Remember, they're masters of first impressions.
That makes sense. It's like they're putting on a performance almost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another red flag is of course that lack of empathy. Do they seem indifferent or even dismissive of other people's feelings? Do they struggle to understand or share in your emotions? That emotional disconnect can be a major warning sign.
I'm starting to see the pattern here, like charm to disarm, and then a lack of empathy to exploit. What else should we be looking out for?
Self-centeredness is a big one. Are they constantly steering the conversation back to themselves? Do they have a grandiose sense of self-importance? Do they name drop or exaggerate achievements? These could be signs of that inflated ego and distorted worldview we discussed earlier.
So it's not just about being a bit self-absorbed. It's a much deeper sense of superiority and entitlement. This is starting to paint a pretty clear picture. But how do their actions match up to these traits? What kinds of behaviors should we be wary of?
Well, their behavior often revolves around manipulation and control. Do they try to guilt trip or emotionally blackmail others to get their way? Do they exploit weaknesses or play the victim to gain sympathy? Do their relationships seem superficial or transactional? These are all tactics they might use to exert power and get what they what they want.
Wow, okay. This is getting a bit intense. I have to ask, and I'm sure our listeners are wondering this too. Have you ever encountered someone who exhibited these traits in real life?
It's funny you should ask. I once had a colleague who, looking back, displayed many of these red flags: the charm, the manipulation, the lack of empathy. It was subtle at first, but over time the pattern became clearer.
That's really unsettling. I think everyone has probably had an experience with someone who gave them a bad vibe, but maybe they couldn't put their finger on why. This is giving me a whole new perspective on those kinds of encounters.
Exactly. And it's important to remember we're not saying everyone who exhibits these traits is a psychopath, but recognizing the patterns, it can help you protect yourself and set boundaries.
So to be clear, we're not encouraging anyone to go around diagnosing people, but what we are saying is being aware of these traits and behaviors, it can be incredibly empowering. It's about protecting ourselves and understanding the complexities of human behavior.
Absolutely. It's about awareness, not paranoia.
Hmm.
And if you do encounter someone who consistently displays these red flags, trust your instincts
Yeah.
and prioritize your own well-being.
This has been incredibly insightful. I'm definitely looking at people a bit differently now. But there's one thing I'm still struggling to grasp. If psychopaths lack empathy and have this distorted worldview, how can they be so successful? You mentioned earlier that they can rise to positions of power. How does that even work?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of why understanding psychopathy is so crucial. The source material actually highlights this very point. In some ways, their lack of empathy and their manipulative skills, they can be advantageous,
Yeah.
especially in competitive environments.
Wait, so their negative traits can actually work in their favor. How is that possible?
About it, they're not burdened by guilt or remorse. They can make tough decisions without hesitation, and they're experts at charming and manipulating their way to the top. In certain fields like business or politics, these qualities can be unfortunately quite effective.
That is truly disturbing. It's like a dark superpower that allows them to thrive in systems that often reward those very traits. But if they're so good at hiding in plain sight, how do we even begin to protect ourselves from this? Is there any way to outsmart a psychopath?
That's where it gets even more interesting. And to delve into that, we need to look at how they think, how they strategize,
Mm.
and how their own tactics can be used against them.
Okay, so we've said that psychopaths can be incredibly successful, even in positions of power. That's disturbing to think about. But what
Yeah.
can we do about it? How do we protect ourselves personally and as a society, I guess?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, and unfortunately, there's no easy answer. But the source material, it does give us some insights into how psychopaths think and operate, and that can help us at least to understand their strategies
Hmm.
and potentially, outmaneuver them.
So let's get into their playbook. How do they strategize? What are their tactics?
One of their key tactics is to identify and exploit vulnerabilities. They're masters at reading people,
Yeah.
figuring out their weaknesses, their insecurities, their desires, and then they use that information to their advantage.
Mhm.
Often creating these scenarios where they appear to be the solution to those very problems.
So they're like emotional predators, preying on our deepest fears and insecurities.
That's a powerful way to put it, and it's not far off. They often position themselves as these charismatic saviors, offering offering support, validation, even love.
Hmm.
But it's all a carefully constructed facade, just to gain control and manipulate.
That's incredibly insidious. But if they're so good at reading people, can we turn the tables? Can we use those tactics against them?
That's where it gets interesting. One of the best defenses is actually self-awareness. The more you understand your own vulnerabilities, the harder it is for them to exploit them.
So it's about knowing ourselves, our strengths and weaknesses, so that way we don't fall prey to their manipulations.
Exactly. Another key strategy is setting firm boundaries. Psychopaths thrive on pushing limits, testing boundaries, seeing how far they can go. By by establishing these clear, non-negotiable boundaries, you're effectively shutting down their manipulative tactics.
It's like taking away their power by refusing to play their game.
Precisely. And another powerful tool is skepticism. Don't take everything at face value, especially if it seems too good to be true. Question motives, look for inconsistencies, and trust your gut instincts.
So we need to be discerning, not just, accepting what we're told or shown, especially when dealing with someone who exhibits those red flags we talked about. But this all sounds very reactive. Is there anything we can do proactively to address this issue on a societal level?
That's where things get even more complex. We need to start by acknowledging that psychopathy exists, that it's a real phenomenon, not just a Hollywood trope. We need to educate ourselves and our communities about the signs, the tactics, and the potential dangers.
So it's about, raising awareness, breaking down the stigma, starting an open and honest conversation about this, often hidden disorder.
Exactly. And we need to support research into the causes and potential treatments of psychopathy. The more we understand about this disorder, the better equipped we'll be to protect ourselves and create a safer society.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. I'm feeling a mix of fascination and, honestly, a bit of unease. But as you said, knowledge is power. The more we understand about psychopathy, the better prepared we are to navigate the world and protect ourselves from those who might seek to exploit us.
You've summed it up perfectly. This isn't about living in fear or suspicion. It's about informed awareness and empowered action.
Well said. To our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on psychopathy, its complexities and its implications. Remember, knowledge is power, and self-awareness is your greatest defense. Stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay safe out there.